Welcome to the Wheeler Centre. My name is Brodie Lancaster. I'll be moderating tonight's Q&A. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that this event is taking place on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. On behalf of everyone here, I'd like to pay respect to elders from the Kulin Nations, both past and present, as well as elders of any other Aboriginal communities who are with us tonight or listening to a recording of this conversation in the future. In Sour Heart, Jenny Zhang tells the stories of young Chinese girls growing up in New York City in the 1990s. This story collection is the first book published by Lenny, the imprint started by Lena Dunham and Jenny Connor, and while it's also Jenny's first novel, her work across genres has been published and read widely for years. A graduate of Stanford University and the Iowa Writers' Workshop for Fiction, Jenny has published 2 collections of poetry and contributed to publications including BuzzFeed, Rookie, The New York Times, and Poetry Magazine. Please, everyone, welcome Jenny Zhang.
Hey.
Hi. I felt weirdly formal the second I sat down, even though I was like, okay, you sit down and then I'm going to introduce you and then you come on the stage. And then as soon as it happened, I was like, oh no.
It was great.
Okay, cool.
Now I can unformalize.
Yeah. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Hey, I'm pretty good too. All right, I'm going to ask my questions now. I have many. But also, just FYI, everybody, there'll be plenty of time to ask Jenny questions at the end. We're going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll leave plenty of space for anyone who has something to ask. More formalities out of the way. Okay. I don't know why I'm all of a sudden very nervous. Okay. When Lenny announced that Sour Heart...
No to nervousness.
Okay.
I'm just... Does everyone know, like, the words that Brodie is wearing?
I didn't even get your reference. Okay,
it
yeah,
says,
you're right.
Brodie's wearing an amazing dress that says no.
When I look down at it, it says on. So double meaning, I guess, kind of. When Lenny announced that Sour Heart was going to be the first book published on its new imprint, you said in an interview announcing it that for women of colour you have to destroy the idea of the correct path and just go on a weird journey that is your own. Can you tell us all a little bit about your weird journey as a writer to get to that point?
Yeah, I think, I just meant there's no, like, model to follow. There isn't already an established way to do it. And I feel like sometimes when I'm like talking to my like queer friends, they say the same thing, like, the way that like we figure out like how we're going to commit to each other, like we kind of build it step by step. And in that same way, I think there are obviously examples of women of color who have amazing writing careers, but they're usually the exceptions. And I think sometimes like modeling yourself after an exception is like not the best thing to do. And sometimes it's like, I always felt like if I wanted my dreams to come true, I would have to make it happen in a way that I hadn't seen before, because what I had seen before basically condemned me to a life where my dreams wouldn't come true. So my weird path, my path is not really that weird, so I really can't give myself much credit for it. My path is very conventional in a lot of ways. And the path that I took was, I went to university. I went to Stanford University for my undergrad, and then I went to the Iowa Writers' Workshop for my graduate MFA, all of which is not weird at all. But I think the weird part of my path was sort of like my mentors, or not my mentors, actually they didn't mentor me at all, my non-mentors, my discouragers, the people who told me to like stop doing what I was doing. But the people like that I met at those institutions like kind of gave me advice that I couldn't really take. Stuff like, never publish anything on the internet. Which is like, that's awesome. Like if like you are getting they're like, you can only get published in publications that will be serialized by the Library of Congress. And I was like, what? Like, how is that ever going to happen?
Journals only.
Yeah, they were like, you should get published in the Sewanee Review. I was like, what? Why? Like, but that's what worked for them, and that was not working for me for a million reasons. Because like I didn't have, for example, a mentor who knew an editor at the Sewanee Review who was like taking my poems and essays and stories and sending it to, you know, assistant editor number 2 at the Sewanee Review. And what worked for me, and I think what worked for a lot of young women, and especially young women of color, was like actually publishing on the internet, because that was a space where places were willing to take a chance on someone who, you know, didn't have a publication credit. And so that's part of like my weird journey or whatever, which is not that weird, but it's just like, it's more like my slightly off journey.
And off in the context of the like, you went to the Iowa Writers Workshop, right, for fiction, but while you were there, started doing poetry and then started writing for the internet and all of those things that are like you're not supposed to do.
Right, yeah. And I think it's also true that for a lot of people, like I think for a lot of women of color too, it's like they are, even being exceptional doesn't guarantee them that spot that I think it does often for other people. And like, in some ways, like I had done exceptionally well. I got into Iowa. I did really well in Iowa, and I couldn't figure out like, why do I still not have an agent? Like, why can I still not get paid more than $50 for something I'm writing? And perhaps some of it was due to my own failings, and perhaps some of it was structural.
In the acknowledgements of Sour Heart, you thanked Lena Dunham for giving a home to stories that you were ready to give up on. How long had you kind of been sitting on the work that's now in the book?
Well, I started writing the first story in Sour Heart when I was 19, and then I think I wrote the last one when I was 25. Maybe, 25. And you know, it wasn't, I had a hard time finding an agent, basically, for the next 5 years. And I had a hard time convincing agents or editors that short stories were like a worthy investment, and that my short stories were a worthy investment. And I kind of started to I gave up on the idea of getting an agent, of getting a book deal. And I was like, I'll just try to publish with a small press. So I would submit work to you know, like, I don't know how it works here. Are there like university presses here? Yeah. Who hold like contests and stuff?
Yeah,
yearly?
and prizes. And, all that kind of stuff.
So I submitted to all of that. You know, I had like my Excel spreadsheet where I like put in all the like different prize deadlines, and it just kind of, you know,
Can
like,
I submit to that one if I submitted to this one?
Yes. Yeah. And then you go from like, I'll submit to the prize that's like $2,000, and then you're like, I'll submit to the prize that's $100, and then you're like, I'll submit to the prize that gives you 20 free copies of your own book. Like, you just keep going like lower and lower and lower. And I think I kind of hit rock bottom in the sense of there was only, I'll submit to the place that I have to pay money to publish my own work at. And I kind of was like, okay, I'm done. Like, there's nowhere else to submit. They've all rejected me, or told me that I was like runner-up, or that they'd be interested in seeing more work. And so I kind of did, I had given up a little bit on those stories, and also most of my friends at that point from Iowa, they were much further in their careers, or the ones who were much further in their careers kind of told me, like, short stories, they're not really the way to go, that I should try to write a novel instead. And I don't know why I didn't like toss them out the window.
Yeah. Lucky you didn't.
Lucky for the whole world.
I had a real moment of like, kind of familiarity reading the first chapter in your book, and I was kind of unsure why Christina felt so familiar to me, and then I realized that I had read her on that story on Rookie a few years ago, but then that same feeling progressed throughout the book as she keeps reappearing, but from other people's perspectives, which was one of my favorite parts of the book. In that,
thank you.
it was like almost like seeing a friend and seeing how she changed, or also being like, how do other people see this girl?
Yeah.
What was that process like of taking these stories that on the surface are individual and then they become part of kind of like a universe where they all exist alongside each other?
Yeah. Well, I like what you're saying. I like to check up on people that I was obsessed with like 2 years ago.
Same.
Do you do that?
Yeah.
Just to be like, how are they doing?
Yeah.
And it's great. Sometimes they're married. Sometimes they're very unwell.
Facebook memories is really great for that. It'll be like, on this day, someone wrote on your Facebook, and you'll be like, I don't know this name. And you go and you're like, oh, they remarried and like this and that. Yeah.
Yeah. Or like, do you ever suddenly be like, oh, I wonder what that like B celebrity from 1995 is up to?
Yeah.
I got like really interested in what Devon Sawa was up to. Do you know about Devon Sawa?
I literally just had him in my head as you were saying that, because I was like, Devon Sawa on Twitter is like such a character.
I think because he was like from 1995.
Yeah.
But it's that thing of like, let's check up a little bit.
I think I'm like mildly psychic. That was a real moment
Brody
of it
is
happening.
really psychic. This is just something.
Just a little bit.
Beware of the energies. But I kind of wanted to bring a little bit of that energy to these stories where it, I didn't want to write it. I wasn't writing a novel. I was writing stories that all belonged in the same world, and time elapses in these stories. And I kind of, the first story, that's great. What is that?
We're all going to be murdered.
I know. I hope there's security. The first story is sort of like the introduction to the world with this family and this girl, Christina, and they kind of are weaved throughout all the other stories. And I did that because for a couple of reasons. One is like that first family, they kind of like failed catastrophically in that story. They don't in any way manage to succeed in whatever you want to call the so-called American dream. They really take to this like the spirit of being quote unquote American by trying to be really carefree and kind of adventurous, and they're like kind of trying to be cowboys. They're like immigrant cowboys, but they like fail terribly at it, and they're punished terribly. And so I kind of wanted that family to be used as like a cautionary tale for all the other families, that way where someone passes through your life and they might not be a big part of your life, but they become symbolic to like your life story. And like, I wanted that family to be the example that all the other families used when they were like, see, we're doing really well in America. Like compared to that family, like they were, dumpster diving. We are buying food, like that kind of thing.
Yeah. Like an
so
urban
I wanted,
legend.
So I wanted that to be part of it. But I also did want that, the small pleasures of being able to check up and be like, are they okay? Is the first girl in the first story, is she doing okay? That's sort of like checking up on Devon Sawa kind of vibe.
Yeah. Shane West is another one. I'm like, Mandy Moore's now on This Is Us. After A Walk to Remember, what did Shane West do?
Oh my God, I forgot about him. He had the really weaselly eyes,
Yes.
right? Okay,
Yeah. He's now wearing a lot of just like those long beanies, those ones that like sit here but are very long in the back.
There's a huge
yeah. So
drag.
he's up to a lot. Yeah. So I mentioned earlier that you wrote for Rookie for some time. That some of the stories, or Christina's story, appeared in Rookie before it was in the book, and that was also where I first encountered your work. What did writing for and about teenagers, specifically teenage girls, did it teach you or influence the way that you kind of use them as a lens to tell these stories in the book?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think writing for Rookie, I'm curious what you think about your own experience, but it taught me like responsibility in a way that I hadn't before. First of all, because I had never written for an audience. I'd never written anything and then expected it to be read by anyone. I'd only written into the void or written into, a class of like 12 students or something like that, where it was like I was writing, but there were no consequences, if that makes sense. There were no stakes. And suddenly, I think because Rookie magazine became such a huge, it just blew up, and there were so many people, young girls, and also not so young, and people reading it. I guess I started to realize that I had that I had to be accountable to what I was saying, that even though I'm still figuring it out at every stage of my life, that I will never get to a point where I have the answers. Even still, like, just publishing something it's like in that moment, you are asserting a little bit that you had a answer for that moment in your life, and other people will read your work as if looking for answers, because that's what people, I think, I don't know, I think that's what I did when I read things when I was 16, 15. I was looking for answers. I wasn't looking for more questions because I was already filled with them. So it was actually really scary. I mean, did you feel that way when you were writing for Rookie?
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things where it's like, you're also kind of like, the word I kept thinking of when you were saying that was like affirmation. Like you're kind of, your job there is to kind of fill a space that people aren't quite sure they know exists just yet, and until they see it and they're like, oh, that's what I couldn't kind of put my finger on.
Right.
And the idea of the kind of responses veered either between like, I really relate to this, or no, there was kind of like deeply kind of like, this is what I've been waiting for, without knowing it.
Totally.
Yeah.
And it's also scary because like I change a lot, and sometimes honestly I look back, and this is the thing that's scary to me about the internet, and maybe why I should only write for things serialized by the Library of Congress.
Full circle.
But sometimes I look at stuff that, I don't know, sometimes I feel like I'm enacting all my mistakes on like a stage that is like forever documented, because sometimes I say things that in 2008 like felt so true to me, but like now in 2018 I don't believe that anymore, or I question that, or I have issues with that. And I think that was like a really hard thing about publishing on Rookie, not in the moment, but after the fact, where I would look back and sometimes I'd think, oh, you were so naive, you were so young. But I was young. Like I was literally younger than I am now. So.
Yeah. And like, despite the fact that you're writing with like hindsight, like often when you're like writing it, because I started writing for them when I was 23, and it's a website ostensibly for teenagers, so it's like I've got so much distance, but you don't really know anything still.
Right. Yeah, totally.
The girls in the book kind of represent that. I feel like they're kind of like, for lack of a better word, like tweens, for the most part, around the age. I kept coming back to this idea as I was reading of like, they're kind of at that point where you like are starting to get kind of self-aware and self-conscious of how you fit, but you don't 100% feel like filled with shame over every decision you make just yet. Yet, but it's inevitable. Why did that kind of specific bracket in time become your focus for like when we were going to meet these characters?
I don't know. I mean, I can only say this is all in retrospect. I don't think any of this was going through my brain at the time. But, you know, I think for girls, like, innocence is very, very, very ephemeral and fleeting. And by innocence, I mean, like, the innocence of not knowing what other people think of you, the innocence of not knowing what society expects of you. I think we have a much shorter amount of time. Some of us are really lucky and get to live in that bubble for a long time. But like, I know for me, it ended pretty early. And, you know, the first time someone made a comment about my body or my face, or like racialized me or sexualized me in a way that was like not just shocking to me, but like there's just like a before and after. Like after that comment, I could never go back to who I was before. Like once I knew that it was a bad thing to have, whatever part of my body that was like discussed, I could never just think of my body as like a vessel for running again. It was now this other thing. It was this horrible thing, this thing that I had to manage, that I had to tame, that I had to make good. And so I wanted to be able to capture a little bit of that before. And so I had to go pretty young for these girls in particular, because these girls grow up, I think, in environments where you don't get to be innocent very long.
They have like a really specific mix of like responsibility and pressure, but also kind of like being the children of parents. They're specifically like daughters, not just girls.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. That's a big part of it too. Yeah.
I was wondering what kind of, I've heard you speak before about like the books that inspire you or that you kind of return to, or the writers that you love. And I love how widely they vary. And I was thinking about films as I was reading your book, like Welcome to the Dollhouse, and this she's French, so it's probably not Catherine Breillat film called Fat Girl from 2002.
Yes.
And I kept thinking of those, about the way that they deal with bodies and like that kind of like gross innocence of like girls who aren't quite sure what, like, how they're kind of inadvertently like coming across as like sexualized to other people without their awareness or like not like consciousness of that. Anyway, that's a tangent, but
no, that's a really good tangent.
Yeah, but I was wondering what you were kind of like reading and consuming and thinking about outside of your own work as you were writing it.
Yeah. I love that you brought up those two movies. I saw them like a long time ago, so I might be misremembering some things, but something to go back to like innocence, and like I remember when I watched Welcome to the Dollhouse. Is that the one? Who's the main character?
It's like Heather Matarazzo.
Yes.
Dawn Wiener is her character.
Yes.
Yeah.
And she's so dorky and funny and quirky and interesting. And then there's like that horrible like scene that's like also played for laughs, where like that guy calls her and is like, I'm gonna rape you after school, and she's like, okay, where should I meet you? Right?
Yeah.
And it's like really, really dark, and it's like horrifying, but it's also like this comedy moment. And I just remember I loved that movie, but I also remember when I watched it as a teen, I was like so annoyed at her, and it was like I was annoyed at her innocence, where I was like, why are you still innocent? Like, you should be ruined by now. Like, you're too old to be innocent. And I think that is part of the spirit of these stories, where I think like girls are also expected and like taught to like, I don't know, like it's not that I think being a girl is inherently means that you're inherently competitive with other girls, but I think it's more like you're put in a position where there is so much pain of that loss of innocence, and so you do feel competitive and angry at like the girls who get to like seem to go through that period of life unscathed. And then I remember with the Catherine Breillat film, Fat Girl, there's all this like stuff in the beginning of the film where, is it with the two sisters? The two sisters.
Yeah.
One of them is like really gorgeous and like beautiful and sort of like, I'm the best.
And they live in this very strange kind of like bougie country house that's also like by the sea, and they drive in like top down like European sports cars.
Right.
It's very strange.
And there's a lot of like these like kind of beautiful sensual images of these girls and their like supple young bodies. And I remember watching that when I was not a young girl, but like a young woman, and and these are all terrible reactions that I judge myself for, but at the time I was like, ugh, like, of course she thinks she's beautiful, but she's gonna like she's gonna be punished for that, like if she doesn't like let go of her own beauty. And it's like another way in which like I turned like inward and violent toward my own, where it was because in that same way, like I know the trap of beauty, and I know the trap of beauty and youth is that at some point any woman who believes in her own everlasting beauty will be punished horribly. And humiliated. And so I was like, when is she going to be humiliated for thinking she's like a beautiful young girl? So I did not answer your questions at all, but it was just, it made me think
yeah.
a lot of just my own reactions
Yeah.
to other depictions of women. Girls.
Yeah. Because being inside these girls' heads are they all written from the first person or?
Yeah. They're all writing from the first person.
Yeah, they're all so internal, and you hear them talking about like, I ignored my grandmother and then she told me she loved me, and you're reading it being like, no, go and like be kind to, but there is that kind of that like strange teenage kind of anger that doesn't really, it exists and has nowhere to go, so you just kind of expel it anywhere. Yeah.
And I really do understand people who are like annoyed with like my writing and my narrators because I would be annoyed with that girl too, where I'm like, ugh, like like we get annoyed when women express pride and confidence and like inflated self-worth, including myself who created these women, like these girls. And so it's just interesting, and I really understand that impulse to be like, who's gonna, I don't know, like put them in their place or something.
Yeah, but I also there was also moments where I was like, oh, I remember being that way, and then like whatever angle you're coming at it from, like a little older, you're like, oh no, I remember being that way.
Yes. What happened to her?
So Sour Heart has been described as a coming of age book, and I was trying to kind of figure out what that it sounds unnecessarily deep, being like, I was trying to figure out what that phrase means. But I realize I usually hear it attached to films mostly about young boys, and very rarely about women's stories. So I was wondering what it means to you and how it kind of relates to how you view your book.
Right. I think when it's like girls, it's always like it's a tale of sexuality. And
girl becomes a woman.
Yes. Reckoning with her body. I mean, and I was very influenced by coming of age films about boyhood. Also, these coming of age books about boyhood. I got really into like these like Irish books about boyhood, like Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man when I was like in high school, and like J.D. Salinger, Catcher in the Rye, and I got really into this book by Roddy Doyle called Paddy Clark Haha, about this year in this young Irish boy's sort of like rough and tumble life. And I got really into the minor arcana of David Mitchell, which is this book, Black Swan Green, which is also about the year in this one boy's life. And I don't know. I mean, I love like transformation and like metamorphosis, but I feel like, in my stories, rather than coming out a butterfly, you like come out a turd or something. Like you're more, you come out disfigured. But like I love the magic of, the literal magic of growing up, and the literal magic of adolescence, and the literal magic of like your body changing and like parts sprouting. It's very like fantastical to me. And I'm over writing about tweens and puberty and adolescence, but I think maybe because I was going through almost like my own second puberty, which was like being in my 20s and like being in graduate school, so not fully being an adult, but sort of play acting at being an adult. And like not being a mother, but being closer to the age that one could be a mother or something. And like, I guess I just felt, there was some like maybe like emotional autobiographical feelings, if that makes sense. I don't know if that's a real thing, that I was feeling that I kind of like transposed into these stories of like young girls growing up.
Like you had to get it all out before you could move on to the next thing.
Yeah. And I think also that feeling of like when you think you're like trash for so long and then you start getting validation and you can't quite accept that like you like cling on to this feeling of being an underdog and being not invited to things, even as you're literally being invited to things. You know?
My God. Yeah.
And that is because like pain is like such a big part of like identity formation. And it's like, who are you without this pain? And so I think, even though I was going through a different kind of transformation, I wanted to write about that, the pain of like shedding behind your old life, even if it's for a better life. You still mourn like what you left behind.
That idea of like believing the thing that people tell you are, even though you're like, no, I'm this other thing that I just got used to being.
Yes.
I'm not ready to go and be that new thing yet.
Exactly.
Why did these stories all take place in New York?
I didn't really think too much about it, but I think, I know like New York is the most like overwritten about like city, in all books and all movies and all TV shows, and to some extent it's like, why write about New York? But I don't know, this is not really answering your question, but it made me think of your question because a couple years ago, a friend of mine was living in New York, and she was pregnant, and she was like, oh, I'm, like I have to leave New York because like no one can have a baby in New York unless they're like really rich. And I like understood where she was coming from, but I also was like, but I was I don't know, I was like, but I was like a baby who like lived in New York, and I wasn't rich, and all of the people actually that I knew who were babies in New York and became full adults were not rich. They weren't even middle class. They were like poor, and I was like, are they just invisible? Like, do they not count? Like, did that not happen? Like, I know that there are babies who don't like, like just get to like be transported by like private limo to like their baby appointments, like in New York, like
their baby academies.
Yeah. I know that exists. I know that there are like children who go to public school in New York, and like I don't think they all die. Like, I think they do make it. And so I just was like, why doesn't that count? And I guess I just was like, I don't know, like I was like, these stories are interesting, and like maybe they're minor, and maybe they're small, and maybe they're even marginal, but like they're interesting to me. And like that New York is interesting to me. And like I know people like who like grew up like in the Bronx who like been to Manhattan like 5 times in the last 10 years because that's like a day trip for them. I know people who like grew up in Queens and they like go to Costco every weekend. Like people don't think about like New York City kids going to Costco, because when people think about New York City kids, they're often thinking about rich New York City kids who live in like certain areas of Manhattan and Brooklyn. But there's also kids who buy $1 Arizona iced teas. Do any of these references like land in Australia?
I know, I've had an Arizona iced tea.
Okay, is there Costco here?
We have Costco. We have one. Yeah.
Okay.
Do you know a weird thing about Costco? Side note, to be able to buy someone a membership, you need to already have a membership.
Oh, so how does that, oh my God, wait, how does that work?
The model is flawed. If someone wants to write a letter, I don't know.
How do you get in the first place?
Literally, I don't know. We had to buy a membership as a gift for someone recently, and they were like, is anyone a member?
No.
It's like, no, that's the point of buying one.
Trying to get them in.
Costco, man.
Wow.
We have it. Yes, we have it.
So it's an exclusive club
We have
here.
dramas with it.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. This is not something that I had prepared, so I'm not sure how I will articulate it. But all of this is making me think about the idea of like being able to write something that's ultra like hyper specific, and that being a way to kind of like give more people access to kind of like relating to it. I thought about this a lot when I was writing my book, and anytime I would like write for Rookie or something, I would always kind of like fall into this habit of being like, well, I want to make sure that anyone anywhere could possibly relate to this, and so I'm going to make it very general and very kind of like porous so that anyone can access it and be like, girls who may do this and may do that, and you could be, you know, like, and then it loses all meaning and kind of like dimension, and figuring out that kind of being hyper specific to an experience kind of does the opposite and makes more people kind of like find a particle of themselves in it. Did you, this is such a leading question. This is what I think. Do you think the same? But like, has that been your experience in talking to people about the book maybe? Like afterwards of being like, you know, the stories might not share an entire experience, but like portions of them gave them something to grab onto?
Yeah, definitely. And I think because of my early experiences with reading were all about, you know, like, I don't know, like, how is like some 12-year-old living in like Queens, New York with like extremely strict like Chinese immigrant parents, like, what's the connection to like Wuthering Heights? Nothing. And yet like I loved it, you know what I mean? Like, and yet it spoke to my soul because actually it was about someone being shut in, I mean, on a totally different part of the world and a totally different century, but it actually was about someone who was like literally shut into this like estate and like who wanted to be wild and like roam like the moors. And so like I connected to that, and I assumed that most, like you're saying, like most rigorous writers don't just want a story that maps exactly onto their own identities and their own experiences, nor do they want something so general that it's tasteless and bland. And I also like really believe in like there are so many different tiers of access. Like I think that there is the, you know, like when I write, I try to be able to like have treats for every kind of reader. And like, I don't know if this is true, but like I want the reader who like maybe grew up in a very similar way as me, who maybe speaks the same language as me, who maybe like knows so many of the references that are like buried in my writing. Like I want there to be something for that reader. I want that person to be able to poke around and like see interesting things. But I also want there to be something interesting for the reader who maybe did not at all like grow up the way I did, who maybe has no frame of reference for the references that I've dropped in, who maybe even speaks a different language. And I'm using language very sort of like flowerly. You know, I want that person to also get something out of it. And there's also like the reader who like, you know, will do a lot of research like about things they don't know. I want there to be something for that reader, but I also want there to be something for the reader who's just reading quickly, who isn't necessarily going to spend a lot of time looking things up or trying to figure things out, who just wants to be entertained, who just like wants to like read. And I think it's good to like have something there for everyone. I don't know now if I actually achieved that, but I think I tried to, and I also tried to never let down that top tier of reader, the one who is, I don't know, as almost, you know, like a confidant, who I'm like whispering a secret to. Yeah.
We're going to open it up for audience questions really soon. I'm just going to ask Jenny one more, and then ushers are going to come around with microphones. So if you put your hand up, they will find you and kind of like pick who will ask the questions. So the last one I want to ask before this is one that I preempted already with you, is that by saying people ask you this all the time, and I don't want to ask it, but I also want to talk about the idea of people asking you about this fiction, this book of fictional short stories, a novel, assuming that it's ripped from the pages of your diary, assuming that there's memoir woven through it, and the idea that, I don't know, there's kind of a friction that exists there, I feel like, between writing the things that are familiar and putting an experience that you know onto a page versus like being appreciated for your
Yeah.
skill as like a you know, a
Yeah.
fiction writer. Can you talk a little about that kind of where this sits in between those two places?
Yeah. You know, it's really tricky because sometimes in my zeal to like elude the question of like how much of this is autobiographical, or in my impatience with how often that is asked, and often that's the first question asked, and you were one of the few who asked it, who didn't ask it and waited till the end, but like but also like I like you and everything. So even if you asked in the beginning, it wouldn't have mattered to me. But I think, you know, in my zeal sometimes to distance myself from that, to like push the person asking me to ask me like a more interesting question, a more literary question, a question that I think literary fiction writers deserve to be asked or something. Like sometimes in my zeal to get away from that, I almost like overcompensate by being like, nothing is autobiographical, which is also not true. And like if anyone writes anything that comes from their soul and there's not even a shred of them in there, then like they're a sociopath. Like that's very bad. Yeah. Like you shouldn't be able to hide every, you know, shred of yourself from your writing. And, you know, I also like push people to like push the definition of autobiographical. Like there's a reason why a lot of anthropologists are white, and yet it's autobiographical, because there's resources and class issues and socioeconomic you know, whatever that like make it so that there's a certain type of person who pursues that kind of work, and that is autobiographical. There's a reason why, you know, people who write war journalism are often, you know, a certain type of person. That's also autobiographical. So it's like everything is, in a sense, autobiographical. But it's also like not. And so like I don't know how to answer that question sometimes, because I want to get into like a more interesting conversation, but I suspect, and I don't know, but I suspect sometimes the person asking me that question is asking me because they want to like verify that like I have the right to write about these things, that if I didn't grow up poor, then like why am I, you know, forcing people to read about poverty or something? Or if I wasn't like sexually abused, why would I ever force my like what I imagine like a scene of sexual abuse would look like on anyone? And like I think that is something that I'm like repelled by, the quest to verify. And I also think like sometimes like people, and this is not always true, but sometimes like people don't believe that anyone could have gone through what the girls in my stories have gone through, but it like somehow makes them feel better if I say that I went through it. Like it's not enough for me to imagine it or to know it in a more oblique way. I have to have actually experienced it. And like I don't really know about that. I don't really know about the value of that verification. And so that's why I get kind of like cheeky about it. But also it's like what you said, like sometimes I'm like, what you're really saying is like, I did such an amazing job writing these stories that it felt real to you. Like, why won't you just say that to me? Why won't you just say this was so vivid and read like memoir? Like, I don't know. I don't know why you won't say that to me, because you suck. Like, so, you know, if that's, sometimes it's like, you know, I get a little, I get bitchy about it.
I mean, it makes sense as well. Like, I remember, I was trying to place where I remember her saying it, but it was on an episode of Another Round, the podcast, and Roxane Gay was, I remember she was talking about her memoir, because she obviously wrote Difficult Women was fiction, and then the same year Hunger, her memoir came out. She was talking about the difference between those two forms and the fact that she was always going to be, it was always going to be assumed that like the work of anyone who has written memoir, writing
Right.
fiction, is just writing their own story but with a different name and like blonde hair instead of brown hair or something, you know?
Right.
Yeah. I have two brothers instead of a sister, you know?
Right,
Yeah.
that you're just making these like sort of like facile like changes
Yeah.
to hide the truth or
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah. All right, your turn now.
Thanks, Brodie.
Does anybody have a question in the audience? I can't see any hands. Are there no hands? Oh, there is. Sorry. There's lights.
Hi. I'm going to ask this question on behalf of a friend who's not here.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So it says, can you ask her what it...
Aww.
This is my favorite question already.
I know. I like it.
what her take is on her use of poo and the abject in her writings. I've been obsessed with it as a form of bucking the model migrant trope, or like creating a sense of intimacy along the lines of shit migrant Asian mums love to talk about, and also by kind of taking pleasure in something that white people are really weirded in talking about.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. What is your friend's name? Panda? Panda? I hope I said it right. Well, thank you for asking that question. Let me try to answer it well because it was asked so well. Two things. I think it's very like, I always say it's very like old country of me. It's very Chinese of me. It's very, I don't know. It's like Chinese people, the ones I'm familiar with, are pretty obsessed with not only what goes in, but also what comes out. And like, I think, I've said this a lot, but like, I think American culture is very obsessed with what goes in, but they're very like cagey and like euphemistic about what comes out. And I'm like, that's insane. Like, you should be you can't be like explicit on the way in and then blurry on the way out. That's wrong. You should be really precise in both directions. And I think it is a form of intimacy and it is a form of love. And I was really inspired when I was younger by like the love letters that Joyce sent his wife, and they were filled with very exacting descriptions of like the rippling sounds of her farts and the lengths of like, their turds, and like I loved that, and I loved it as like a form, as like a literary form, a scatological form, as a form of love letter writing, as a form of play, as a form of mischief, and I just was like, why should, only James Joyce get to do this? Like, or like Mozart, like, no, I get to do this as well. Anyone gets to do it. And like, I just like it. It's just something I've always liked. It's been a part of my life. It's also like a part of having a body, and like these stories, as like I've been discussing with Brodie, are about having a body, and it seems just so disingenuous and fake to have like a closed up butthole like in these bodies. No, that's not going to work. I'm maybe not supposed to point.
I know we're not like talking about him as someone that we like anymore, but I remember Louis C.K. once in an interview talking about like his kind of relationship to his first daughter, who I think when she was born, his wife was like under heavy anesthetic and like he was the first parent to hold her, and he said, I remember feeding her for the first time and then seeing her just like shit black for the first time and being like, oh, this is how a human works. This is like, I'm seeing like a human working like a machine for the first time. That's like, it goes in and then it happens.
Right.
That's the second time in a week I've quoted that interview with Louis C.K. I don't know what's happening. All right, I'm sorry. Next question.
I really like it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi. I guess my question relates to the article I think you wrote about the white guy who used like an Asian name to submit poetry. So my question then is, how do, as a person of color or as an Asian American, especially as an East Asian, How do we balance this very real need to have a space where we can represent ourselves and share our stories and experiences of marginalization with the fact that often these spaces also make people more blind to or more reluctant to acknowledge the ways in which they punch down on others? So, for example, anti-Blackness within the Asian community. So is it really enough to simply amplify other people's work, or is there more work to be done here? Like, for example, the community taking a good, long, hard look at itself and what it's actually doing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been grappling with that question a little bit more actually on this trip, because I think, a lot of times I get asked to be part of like a panel, and I suspect it's because the people organizing the panel would like to be able to take credit for having a diverse panel, and they've invited me, an Asian American woman who is also an immigrant. They always say like, well, your voice is needed more than ever in this climate. Their eyes go like dead as they say climate. It's very scary. And that's like, I'm tipped off to like what's happening. But
A bunch of little clues to solve.
yeah, little tinkling clues. And then like what happens is like, I go on the panel and like, I don't know, I'm like, what did I just do? Like, I'm now speaking for all people of color. It's that thing of like, I'm not speaking precisely at all. Everything is blurry. The different experiences of different communities are not insignificant. And I don't want what I'm saying to now become like, I don't know, like, I don't want the white people who like organize the panel and come to this panel to come away feeling like good about themselves, that they like saw this like woman of color speak. I don't know, like that feels very weird. And then I've also noticed that sometimes I'll be on like panels with like other Black women. This happened at the Sydney Writers Workshop at Sydney Writers Festival last week, where I was on this really great panel on intersectional feminism with Zinzi Clemens and Aminatou Sow, and Jamila Rivzi, I hope I'm getting all their names right, and Nakia Louie, and just amazing women. And I just had this like sinking feeling after this panel where everyone was speaking so amazingly and so cogently and so like just literally being inspirational, and to the point where I was like, I wish I was in the audience. Like, I don't know why I'm up here. I feel like I shouldn't be here. And that was compounded by the fact that afterwards, all of these very, very, very nice, well-meaning white women in their 50s came up to me afterwards, and they were like, you know what, like, you were actually the best one. Like, you weren't angry, you were so quiet, and you had such a small voice, but actually, like, you were the voice of reason, and you were really powerful. And, like, I appreciated that, but I also was like, yeah, of course you relate to me. Like, I became very aware of how white adjacent I was and how non-threatening I seemed. And I felt very frustrated because actually I didn't think I was the best one. I thought I was the worst one. And I thought that, but I also was like, of course you relate to me. My body is not really subject to like state-sponsored violence at any given moment, just as your body is not. And like, I'm like thin and able-bodied, and I speak like quote unquote well, and I'm educated. And so I just was like, so what do I do? Like, the fact that I said yes to be on this panel already made me take that space, and like, just by existing the way I do, I will be rewarded in a way that like the other women on the panel won't be. And so that was a really long way of saying I have no idea. I'd love to keep the conversation going afterwards, and I'd love to hear more from people. And one thing I am doing now is I think at some point I don't need to really be on those panels anymore, and I can stop speaking, and I can maybe like suggest someone else to speak instead of myself, because I think you've heard like a lot from people like me at some point, and like I can cede that space and not, you know, occupy it all the time. Yeah.
Hey, just jumping off from that answer, do you feel like there's a pressure in your actual writing as well to somehow represent a large portion of women of color's experiences because you are also women of color? And if so, how do you navigate that when it comes to like creating stories?
I think I try not to let that pressure, you know, spread like a horrible disease in my brain when I'm writing, because that pressure is constant, and that pressure is it never ends. And as we were talking about, actually, you know, trying to cover a large swath of experience is not powerful. It's actually the opposite of powerful, at least in writing and literature and fiction. It's, I don't know what the word is. It's just not, it's not very powerful or moving or affecting. And I try not to worry about that when I'm writing, at least in my first drafts. But I think it's when I know that something is going to be published, when I'm editing it in its like second and third drafts, that's when I try to like re-enter the world that actually exists. And the world that actually exists is really unfair. And it's a world that lets, you know, lets there be like one voice of like whatever X community. Like there's always one person being trumpeted and heralded at any moment. And so I think that's when I ask myself, like, if I am that one voice, if I do take that spot, if I am being thrust there, like, am I being responsible with what I'm saying? Is the amount of harm that I might cause, am I willing to live with it, basically? Can I be okay with that? Do I feel like I'm offering something that is good enough and worthy enough that, because also it's like you can't, there's no such thing as creating like a work of art that isn't going to harm anyone. You know what I mean? Like everything, I mean, it's just not going to be possible to please everyone. It's not going to be possible to speak for everyone. It's not going to be possible to create something that doesn't like traumatize anyone. That is like the risk of art, and it is what makes it in some ways indefensible, and all the ways like people try to justify why we need art kind of falls flat, because part of, to me, the point of art and literature is it's not on a need basis. It's like, it's an indulgent thing, and these indulgences feel amazing to consume. Like a lot of times I consume art and I couldn't even tell you what it does for me. I couldn't even tell you the utilitarian function of it, but it like makes me a bigger person and broader. And so, long way of answering, in the end, it's at that final stage of editing that I ask, like, did I create something that I hope broadens more people's souls than like limits it and closes it into a tiny little nub?
I think we have time for one more question.
So one thing that I really like about your writing is the way that the families in your stories touch each other. So in How It Feels, the narrator describes like her mother rubbing her earlobes, which is like the most beautiful sensation. And in a lot of stories in Sour Heart, like the children will sleep between their parents or will like otherwise be touched by their parents. And in my experience, white families are so sterile and so like afraid to just touch each other. So I was just wondering if there was any like significance to the way that the Chinese families in your stories like touch each other and like engage in that physical intimacy.
Yeah, I think, thanks for that question. I think one thing I wanted to show was when you grow up without a lot, when you're kind of in literal close quarters with other people, when you are living several families to an apartment or a room, your bodies kind of have to touch. Like you can't really, have like, space between bodies is you have to be able to afford that. It costs money to be able to never like touch someone or brush past someone. And, I think about it every time. This is such a tangent. Like every time I walk past first class on like the airplane, I'm like, damn, you paid for your elbows to not touch your neighbor's elbows, and I can't afford that. But so I wanted to show, that was like a way for me, I guess, to show one of the, I wouldn't say like positive aspects of poverty, but like just a real aspect of being poor. But I also wanted to show like that it's kind of beautiful, and it goes back to what we were talking about of like, I don't think any of these characters, I don't think any of them want to go back to that, one room that they shared with 4 other families. But there is this feeling of like, well, at least when we had nothing, all we had were each other. And like, we were like stacked up like taco shells because we only had one bed. So we had to sleep like that on a single bed. And it's not that they want to go back to that room with just a single bed for 3 people, but it was so beautiful, and it felt so good to literally be sandwiched for these characters in my stories between their parents, and they might not ever have the opportunity to do that again. And I don't know, that felt like something I wanted to show. Thank you. Oh my God.
Can everyone join me in thanking Jenny?
And thank you to Brodie Lancaster.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.